Good. Well, a very warm welcome to our 4th session of the conference, From the Rising to the Setting Sun, which is looking at global perspectives on Bible and violence. And welcome to the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. My name is Helen Paynter, and I'm the director of the centre. I'm aware that not everybody who's here will be familiar with the centre, so I'm just going to take just a minute and a half to tell you what it's about. So I'm the founding director. I set it up in about two and a half years ago. Initially to look at interpretation of biblical violence, and that's still very much part of our focus, which is what we'll be doing tonight, but also looking at, we kind of expanded that then to look at the use and abuse of the Bible in a violent world, which is also a major thrust of our work these days. We are at core, we are a Christian centre, but we are very pleased and proud to work with people of all faiths and of no faith. And one of our core values is good listening, irenic dialogue and conversation, and has been a hallmark of the conference so far, and I'm very confident it'll be continue in that way tonight. Brandon is going to be hosting this evening, and he will properly introduce our speakers in a few minutes. Let me introduce Brandon. Brandon has been one of the research associates since almost the very inception of the centre. He's coming towards the end of his PhD at Durham University. He's working on the Book of Judges. And I'm delighted that we have 4 speakers tonight. As I say, Brandon will introduce them properly, but I'm just going to say a welcome to them first. So our keynote tonight will be delivered by Dr. Johanna Stiebert. And then our 3 papers are from Siobhán Jolley, Hannah Baylor, and Alexiana. So welcome to all 4 of you, sorry, can't count. I'm delighted that you're all with us, and really looking forward to what you're going to be saying to us tonight. For those of you who like to use Twitter, you might like to live tweet. We would be delighted if you would live tweet. And in a moment, I'll put the hashtag into the chat, but it's CSBV Con 21, but I'll pop that into the chat in a moment or two. So that would be great. Those of you who've been to one of our events before will know that we always start in a particular way. Thinking about violence, whether ancient or contemporary, is our bread and butter, really, and we think about it every day. And we never want to become immune to the fact that violence has somebody on the sharp end of it, that violence always has a victim, or usually multiple victims. And so this is never an entirely academic exercise. This is always something that has real implications in the real world. And we want to honour the victims that we'll be talking about tonight, and the many, many victims who are kind of represented, as it were, both in the things we talk about and people in the room as well. And so the way we do that is I'm going to light a candle and invite us to keep silence for 20 or 30 seconds. I'm going to pop the candle behind me where you'll be able to see it, and it will burn then for the remainder of the evening. Thank you. Over to you, Brandon.
Well, I'm very glad that we've gotten, hopefully, our technical difficulties sorted. So thank you for bearing with us with that. Let me add my welcome to that of Helen's. Thank you so much for being here this morning, afternoon, evening, or maybe for some of the more enthusiastic scholars, the middle of the night. Just in case you are lost, this session is the Creative Readings of Biblical Texts, which focuses on a reader-centered interpretations of biblical texts of violence. We have an incredible session with some amazing papers, and I'm sure we'll provide plenty of conversations that will follow us long after this session is over. Before we begin, though, this I would say that this entire session comes with a content warning. A number of these papers specifically address gender-based violence or sexual assault, both in the present day and in the narratives of the Bible. For some of us, these issues are very personal and can easily be a source of trauma or can be re-traumatizing. And the last thing that the CSBV wants to do is to contribute to that. So if at any moment you need to leave the Zoom call, or maybe you simply need to mute us and leave the room at home, please feel empowered to do that. We want this to be a safe place for you, even when we are discussing heavy topics such as the Bible and violence. Our schedule for this evening is as follows. We will have our keynote address by Johanna Stiebert, which I will introduce in a minute. After her paper, we'll have some time for questions and then a short 5-minute comfort break, or if you need to quickly eat your dinner or your lunch. Following that, we will have our 3 papers, each with time for questions at the end of each paper. And my hope is that we will have enough time for about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for like an open Q&A for all the papers. So that's my hope and my plan. Hopefully we can get there. Someone who needs no introduction, but will nevertheless get one. Dr. Johanna Stiebert is a professor of theology and religious studies at the University of Leeds. Previously, she has taught in the United States and in Botswana. Her main interests include Hebrew Bible, philology, and studying the reception of biblical texts and its relation to gender-based violence. In addition to serving as a co-leader of the Shiloh Project, which investigates the intersection of the Bible and rape culture, Dr. Stiebert also researches religion and gender-based violence in several African countries. Her most recent book is entitled Rape Myths, the Bible, and #MeToo. Her paper this evening is entitled Virginity, Violence, and Biblical Text. So, Johanna, over to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for this privilege. And thank you, Brandon, for your introduction and for helping me with the technical difficulties we had. If we could just have the first slide up, please, so you don't have to look at me the whole time on a big screen. Thank you very much. And I'll just give you a little nod when we need to proceed. As Brandon said, these topics are difficult. Talking about violence, gender-based violence is difficult. And I think it's difficult when these images and when these conversations come into your home, when we're having an online conference like this, your home, which may be your safe place, your haven. And I'm trying to be mindful of that. And I'm trying very hard not to be gratuitous in what I say. But at the same time, I do feel that these texts are there and we want to create an environment where we can discuss them and confront them and hopefully defuse them and the violence they bring. So in terms of the creative reader response aspect, what follows reflects how I receive and connect texts and impressions. I am drawn to working on difficult and violent biblical texts, but not because these texts particularly resonate with my personal experience. Next slide, please. Like probably all women listening right now, I have experienced sexism, sexual harassment, and coercion. But the events recounted in my 2 primary focus texts today are not traumas I have experienced. I try to read a newspaper every day. I don't read all of it. I skip the sports pages and the financial pages. I do read the national and international news. In the Hebrew Bible, there are also texts I tend to skip, but I keep coming back to the narratives and to the legal texts. In the course of reading widely, including in newspapers and the Hebrew Bible, stories come together, enter into dialogue. Stories of Yazidi women whose appalling abuse has been justified by a theology of rape. Stories of the Rohingya refugees and from evidence brought before ICSA, alongside stories of Jephthah's sacrificed daughter, of Tamar reasoning with her brother, of the women described in the scenarios of casuistic laws, and of the Midianite women and girls whose lives are preserved for the purpose of rape. So here goes, and you're going to have to hear me sing, in which I can't do very well. Half a pound of Tiffany rice, half a pound of treacle. That's the way the money is spent. Pop goes the weasel. I used to sing that to my children when they were little, and they always looked forward with giddy anticipation to the pop. They never asked, does a weasel really go pop? And they also thankfully never asked, what's Tiffany rice? Because it's actually tuppenny rice. Not raised in an English-speaking environment, and therefore not with English nursery rhymes, I learned the ditty later, and it turns out I misheard it. Somehow, I guess because who we are and what we do imprints so much of how we view our world, this reminds me of how easily what the Bible says, or what we think it says, is not challenged, even when it's strange, like popping weasels, even when it's downright obscure and baffling, like Tiffany rice, even, as I will go on to argue, when it's frightful. When you go down the rabbit hole and explore further, the parallels between the nursery rhyme and biblical interpretation multiply. Hence, the origins and dating of the rhyme are uncertain. It may be based on an earlier version. Here we go round the mulberry bush. It has gone on to become other things, the name of a boat, the name of a dance. The popping weasel has been interpreted quite literally as a dead weasel, but also as a tailor's flat iron, a hatter's or a spinner's tool, a piece of silver plate, or with reference to a variant via Cockney rhyming slang for weasel or stoat, to injury to the throat. Emerging from childhood, pop begins to develop other quite troubling undertones relating to popping the cherry. Could we have the next slide, please? Slang for what is otherwise termed losing one's virginity. This expression too is telling. To lose denotes either something careless or something regrettable. It means to fail to win or to fail to retain. Losing one's virginity has no universal meaning, but tends to refer to first-time penetrative sex, either between men or most often a woman and a man. Sex between women does not seem to count. This is due to meanings of virginity resting on dominant understandings of what sex is, which is culturally contingent. The expression to pop the cherry may convey an attempt at euphemism or awkwardness in talking about sex, or a clumsy attempt at humor. The cherry carries echoes of, on the one hand, forbidden and tempting fruit, and on the other, of blood-like redness and stains. I'm sure I was not the only one who, coming of age, imagined losing my virginity in violent terms as the stretching, breaking, and tearing of the hymen and the releasing of blood. Next slide, please. Coming of age in the 80s in the shadow of AIDS added also the fear of the bursting condom to the fear of the popping cherry. Tearing hymens and bursting condoms may be urban myths, but they are surprisingly tenacious ones. Even consensual sex with someone loved and trusted was, when for the first time, scary and imagined as inevitably entailing pain, force, a degree of violence. In the background of this, purity culture remains powerfully influential. While promoted particularly by ideologies of conservative religious communities, its influence, including and particularly with regard to the fetishization of virginity, extends well beyond. Theological discussions of Mother Mary's perpetual virginity or of Adam and Eve's virginity prior to eating of the fruit may sound arcane to modern ears. Indeed, too, there is certainly in modern Western contexts also a countercurrent of pressures, according to which being a virgin for what is deemed to be too long or having no experience is also undesirable, even risible. Next slide, please. Even growing up outside of a religious home, I still remember as constant the self-monitoring and the negotiations of how far, so far, too far in matters sexual, that pathway between promiscuity and prudishness. Moreover, and here we get to the heart of female virginity being that which is really at issue, we still live in a time of virginity tests, hymen reconstruction, and revirgination surgery. Next slide, please. The Bible is deeply entangled in the fetishized perception of female virginity as female purity, which carries the clear subtext that when a female is no longer a virgin, she is no longer, or at least less, pure. The only way not being a virgin can be managed or redeemed for a female, it seems, through being married, practicing continence, and having children. A woman who is not a virgin and unmarried, or married and childless, or a widow, is either suspect or pitiable. The Virgin Mary, by contrast, is the ideal, both virginal and pure, and a mother. Next slide, please. The webs of association between purity and virginity on the one hand, and whiteness, beauty, high class, nobility, piety, and so forth on the other, run very deep and cannot be pursued here. Also deeply ingrained is an association between what is still called loss of virginity and violence. And this, like some of the other associations just mentioned, resonates in religious imagery and texts, including in the Hebrew Bible. Next slide, please. Popping the cherry alludes to female virginity as tempting and consumable. Biblical overtones are discernible. While the forbidden fruit of the Eden story is not traditionally a cherry, but either a fig or an apple, usually a cherry red one, and while the tree of knowledge from which it comes is not explicitly associated with carnal knowledge, the web of associations exists. One resonance is the idea that losing one's virginity somehow confers instant new knowledge or insight, the expectation that the world will immediately, as quickly as biting into a fruit, appear different. There's a letdown. So in this equation, while virginity, purity, and innocence are lost, carnal knowledge and other insights are gained. The notion of loss of virginity transpiring in a woman's loss of blood and in staining might also be confirmed by the Hebrew Bible. There's not very much to go on here, but there is the text of Deuteronomy 22. Next slide, please. An example of casuistic law. Now, casuistic law is the if this, then that variety and describes a scenario or refers to a precedent. The scenario here is recounted with some detail and vivid direct speech, by the males anyway, that is the husband and the father. The mother and daughter-wife are mentioned, but no words of theirs are recorded. The law describes a man who has taken a wife and then comes to dislike her. Next, he says nasty things about her and gives her a bad name, saying, "This wife I have taken, I drew near her and found she did not have Bethulim." In JPS, the translation has, "I found that she was not a virgin," but the NRSV is closer with, "I did not find evidence of virginity." The Hebrew word is a plural form that is clearly related to the widely used word Bethulah, a feminine noun meaning virgin, for which, revealingly, there is no masculine form. The plural appears in its construct form, Bethuleh, in the next verse, where the young woman's father and mother make public the evidence of their daughter's virginity. The father declares the circumstances before the elders. He gave his daughter in marriage. Now her husband dislikes her and has made up charges. He said, "I did not find your daughter's evidence of virginity," literally virginities. A plural can denote something abstract, such as virginity, but here something concrete seems to be at issue, some kind of visible sign or evidence. This something is what the parents spread out before the assembled elders. It is called the simlah. This word can refer to a garment or wrap. Perhaps this is some kind of bed covering or cloth, and perhaps the evidence of virginity is a stain of blood on the cloth. This is what most interpreters suggest, pointing to such a practice in traditional communities of the Mediterranean world. If the evidence is produced, the husband is flogged and fined because he has given a bad name to a virgin of Israel. He can never divorce her. This punishment is profound, physically painful, publicly humiliating, costly in economic and social terms. Accusing one's new wife of not being a virgin at the time of marriage is a high-stakes matter. It is interesting how the law up until now is framed in terms of suspicion falling on an accusing husband, not on the woman. Next slide, please. An addendum, however, states that if the evidence of virginity is not found, then the young woman is to be brought to the doorway of her father's house and stoned to death on account of the nevalah, that is the detestable thing she has done in Israel, which is expanded on as whorings, or here fornication, in her father's house, an evil that must be swept away. Whichever way you look at it, the scenario would have spelled dread for a woman. If she was a virgin on her wedding night, there would still in all likelihood have been anxiety about producing a blood stain. Would pressure to produce a stain have encouraged roughness or surreptitious cutting to make sure there would be a stain? Was causing pain and feeling pain or performing feeling pain understood as properly part of the wedding night? The bedcloth would have been scurried away in the event of being required for proof. The woman may have asked herself, was there a stain? Was there enough of a stain? If accused by her husband of not being a virgin, she would suffer public shaming. If it came to a proof ceremony, to the display of the stained cloth before the elders at the gate, this would have been embarrassing at best. And always in the background would have been the fear, what if the stain was not visible or not visible enough? And then, what if the woman was not a virgin? According to Deuteronomy 22, the only option this leaves is that she was therefore someone who fornicated while in her parents' house, someone who has done a terrible thing, something that must be blotted out brutally and decisively. Nothing, it seems, could accommodate a premarital seduction. There's no acknowledgement here of women, including virgin girls, being at high risk of sexual abuse, even though, looking at biblical texts, Dinah is raped when she goes out to visit the women of the land. Tamar isn't safe from her own brother. Virgins are raped in towns and in open fields, which is why there are laws to address such cases. Boaz instructs his male workers not to molest Ruth, a risk also mentioned by Naomi. And in situations of threat, fathers, namely Lot and the old Ephraimite man, are depicted as not above offering up their virgin daughters to barter with thugs. All this suggests that what we might call the biblical world was not a safe place for women, and that for all the importance, even veneration of virginity, virgins were hardly safe either. Going back to bloodstains, next slide, please. I doubt I am the only woman who has spent a great deal of her adult life worrying about the possibility and existence of bloodstains, stains on clothing that might become visible on standing up, unexpected stains on sheets, that sort of thing. I doubt I am the only woman who has furtively washed bloodstains from bedding or underwear. In German, the menstrual cycle is called die Regel, presumably because it is supposed to be regular. But, newsflash, women's periods are not all in sync or in unison with the ocean tides and waxing moon. Instead, they can be and often are all over the place, which exacerbates concerns about leaking and staining. I imagine such anxiety to be particularly acute in settings where blood, especially menstrual blood, was overlaid with purity taboos, which is the indication of the context reflected in the Hebrew Bible. Here, the onset of menstruation is described as setting in motion 7 days of restrictions. Sex with a menstruating woman constitutes a severely contaminating impurity, which can risk ostracism and is occasionally likened to incest. How rigorously the specified restrictions were actually practiced is hard to know, but in Orthodox Judaism, it has led to watchful checking for spotting, as well as to an even longer period of separation between a woman and her husband than is prescribed in Torah. As I imagine it, self-monitoring of bloodstaining may have been something of a preoccupation in the communities behind the Hebrew Bible too. But the one time a woman may well have been desperate to produce a bloodstain was on the occasion of her wedding night, because this was Bethulim, proof of her virginity, her honor, proof that she was not a disgrace in Israel, some protection against divorce, possibly even against a violent death. Now, the text we've looked at so far is not so bad in the scheme of Hebrew Bible virginity texts. Deuteronomy 22 seems to presume a marriage between a woman protected in her parents' house and a man, arranged between the man and the woman's father. The text, moreover, is skewed against the husband. He is described as making up charges, slandering his wife, disputing her virginity at the time of marriage. If evidence is produced to refute his accusation, the woman's name will be restored and the husband will be punished. But even a regular arranged marriage, I argue, as suggested by this text, implies expectations of virginity loss being enwrapped in fear and possibilities of pain, force, threat, and violence. Now, next slide, please. Let's turn to another considerably more vicious text about virginity. This one is from Numbers 31. The chapter begins with God speaking to Moses and demanding vengeance on the Midianites. Moses duly puts this divine order into action and war begins. This is emphatically a so-called holy war. Phinehas, the priest, is in attendance with vessels of the sanctuary. Phinehas, unlike what one might expect of a priest, given holiness regulations that prescribe contact with corpses, has earlier received God's approval for his zeal in turning back divine anger by piercing Zimri, an Israelite, and Cosbi, his Midianite wife, presumably in the act of consummating their marriage. The battle with Midian, recounted in Numbers 31, leads to the killing of every male, including the kings and Balaam, the prophet who had earlier been used by God as a vessel for divine prophecies. Moses becomes angry, not on account of this bloodbath, but because the women were not killed. It was the women, he rages, who, following Balaam's advice, led the Israelites astray, giving rise to a destructive plague. Every male is to be killed among the Midianites' little ones. That's male infants, toddlers, little boys, all of them. Boys can be so vulnerable in biblical texts. Pharaoh in the Exodus story orders every Hebrew boy killed because boys grow into fighting men or blood avengers. There are multiple stories of killing sons to take vengeance or to prevent trouble from avengers down the line. Hence, the Gibeonites demand 7 of Saul's sons for slaughter before the Lord on the mountain of the Lord. And Atalia attempts to kill all sons in the royal family. And here too, all the boys, like all the men, are killed. Moses also demands that every woman who has known a man is to be killed. There is just one exception. Moses specifies that female children, and the word here is not na'ara, widely used for a young woman in the Deuteronomy laws, but hataf banashim, literally the little ones among the women, in all likelihood meaning young females. They are specified as ones who have not known the lying with a male. So clearly virginity is at issue here. These girls, Moses says, keep alive for yourselves. And I am in agreement with Andreas Michel when he writes, in a horrifying way, there is no limitation of age in the direction of small children. The lack of such a limitation, the clear sexual connotation, who have not known a man, together with the for you, and additionally the fact that this is a positive instruction or permission given by Moses, make this verse gruesomely violent. The virgin girls survive, and this can hardly be called lucky. They have seen their fathers, mothers, brothers, and other relatives killed. Indications are they've been kept alive to be violently abused. Virginity is a trophy, a spoil of war. Rape is depicted in such terms elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, such as in the victory song of Deborah and Barak, where there is reference to victorious soldiers taking, literally, a womb or two each, a crass euphemism for a rampage of rape. In Numbers 31, it is not clear whether the girls are kept alive after their violation. There is reference to a need for fighters who have killed and for their captives to be purified subsequently. Given that only young virgin girls have been captured rather than slaughtered, this seems to indicate that they were kept alive, possibly in some kind of sexual slavery. After this, the text turns to purification of the loot and garments, to division of the booty, and to sanctification. The chapter ends with reference to the sacred tent of meeting and a memorial for the children of Israel before the Lord. Violence, sanctified. Violent rape of virgin girls, sanctified. So what do we do with a text like this? I agree with Helen Paynter and with Samantha Yu that violent texts of the Bible cannot be equated in every case with advocacy for violence. Paynter is right that in the dreadful story in Judges 19, the brutality done to the Levite's wife and almost done also to the Ephraimite host's virgin daughter is depicted sparsely, far from gratuitously, let alone pornographically. As with the narrative, could we have the next slide, please? I'm sorry. As with the narrative of the sacrifice of Jephthah's virgin daughter, the lead up to the violent act is considerably more detailed and drawn out, while the violent climax is succinctly recorded. This is not writing that invites us to dwell on the violence enacted on the female body, or that advocates, let alone glorifies such violence. Describing violent acts, Paynter rightly reminds us, is not to be confused with prescribing such violent acts. Samantha Yu is also right, I believe, in pointing out that victims of violence, while not always having a voice in the biblical text, are not necessarily either voiceless or depicted without sympathy. The Levite's wife, who along with the virgin daughter has no direct speech in the narrative of Judges 19, nonetheless communicates affectingly and eloquently with her gesture of her hands on the threshold. And other victims of violence also communicate with gestures. Rizpah with her persistent mourning ritual as she protects her son's corpses. Tamar tearing her robe. Unique among virgins who suffer violence in the Hebrew Bible, Tamar does have a voice. Her words are imagined and recorded by the omniscient narrator. Tamar tries to persuade, reason with, and fend off her attacker. When all her efforts fail, far from hiding, Tamar enacts her pain and the shame she endures. She tears the garment that signifies her royal virgin status in an enactment of her violently torn hymen, and she cries out loudly. This is a passage as remarkable as it is heartrending. Virgins in the Hebrew Bible, whether they are designated Bethulot or wives who have passed some sort of test transpiring in Bethulim, or females who have not known a man, are vulnerable females and in the crosshairs of violence. Virgins are desirable. They signify social status, economic worth, conduits for male alliances and rewards in war. This makes them valuable and vulnerable. An end to their status as virgins reduces their value, some of which can be reclaimed on becoming mothers, especially of sons, but does not reduce their vulnerability. They must ensure they practice fidelity and be seen to do so. Next slide, please. They can still be found displeasing and be divorced or be displaced by other women. They can be ill-treated in marriage or accused of infidelity. Their vulnerability as virgins and subsequently vulnerability as wives is in part a matter of their comparative lack of power, manifested, for instance, in their frequent silence in the biblical text. Violence, including sexual violence, results from exploitation of power. But insistence on constructing this solely along bipartite gendered lines obscures nuance. The majority of sexual abuse victims in contemporary UK statistics, as in the record of the Hebrew Bible, are female, above all because females are disproportionately powerless and vulnerable. When other groups of persons are made vulnerable, they too become victims of sexual violence, often on a large scale. The child migrants from poor families in the UK sent to Australia and elsewhere, where many went on to be abused, are one example. The majority of those abuse victims, well over 60%, were young boys. The Rohingya people escaping Myanmar, men, boys, women, girls, are another. With a whole population rendered vulnerable and powerless, terrible abuse on Rohingya men and boys has escalated. We miss the point and we overlook many victims if the primary question we ask is whether a perpetrator is misogynist or misandrist, homosexual or heterosexual. The more pressing question is who takes power and who is rendered powerless and vulnerable. Gender is certainly not irrelevant here by any means, not least because women and girls remain those abused in largest number. But sexual orientation or sex in and of itself as a motivation skews the point. This is much more about male-male or male-female directed abuse of power, and other dynamics are possible too. Males in the biblical world and beyond hold more power than females. Female virgins, being young and female while powerless, are valuable too. Sons may be more valuable, but they are also acknowledged as holding greater potential for danger and competition, which makes them vulnerable. Hence the many instances of eliminating, that is wholesale killing or threatening the killing of boys and sons. Numbers 31 is in some ways more disturbing than Judges 19 or 2 Samuel 13. The narratives of the Levite's wife and of Tamar recount dreadful violence. They describe but do not prescribe violence. In both, the narrator portrays with some sympathy and with regard to Tamar some attempt at interiority the violence endured. Numbers 31 is more troubling. There is victim blaming here. Women of Midian are particularly singled out for leading the Israelites astray. All women who are not virgins are killed. There's also a great deal more violence that is mentioned casually in passing, such as the killing of all the little boys. Only the virgin girls are kept alive. The implication of the word tough is that some were possibly very young. These little girls have witnessed terrible violence before experiencing more. No attempt is made at individualizing them, communicating their words, expressing their pain. None. This absence of interiority and vividness is probably why this text receives little attention and little outrage. And yet it is a text of extreme violence against virgins, possibly little girl children. It sits, moreover, among other texts that also fetishize virginity and also link sex with a virgin with a wider context of violence. Dreadful too about Numbers 31 is the justification of violence, of murder and sexual violence, by sanctifying it, by having Moses and God ordain it. Despite what the non-biblical proverb says, I can't accept that all is fair in love or war. In my view, this violence cannot be condoned and it cannot be defended. This is not just a text of terror, it's a terrorist text. So, next slide, please. Pop goes the weasel. Apparently, among other meanings, the expression might also be a slang term for pawning one's coat in a desperate attempt to alleviate poverty. Again, pawning one's coat recalls the biblical text. Once you know it well, you see it everywhere. Like the expression popping the cherry, this reference to pawning and poverty would make the popping weasel ostensibly light-hearted and actually troubling and violent. Next slide, please. Female virginity in the Hebrew Bible, I have argued, is encoded in a web of allusions that encompasses value and allure, violence and vulnerability, allusions to forbidden fruit, staining, blood, force, purity and impurity. This applies to Deuteronomy 22, a text that is in many ways mostly on the side of protecting from slander recently married women. In Numbers 31, virginity is what preserves the life of young Midianite girls, but also what exposes them to violence. This violence, disturbingly, is wrapped in language of triumph, sanctity, and divine authorization. Both texts betray an excessive and obsessive regard for and value placed on female virginity. Both surround both the maintenance and the losing of virginity with threat and with violence. I see no escape in supersessionism, namely the notion that texts from the Hebrew Bible are superseded by a preferable and more loving, less condemning Christian theology. This is because the New Testament also has texts that reinforce female modesty and texts that metaphorize legitimate punishment as gendered violence. It is no accident that purity culture has a firm hold in plenty of Christian communities, and it is a fact that domestic violence is in the UK no less prevalent in Christian than in Jewish communities or than in the general public. Meanwhile, the Jewish tradition not only lacks an unforgivable sin, but it too has traditions of gentle, wise men, comparable with Helen Paynter's compelling characterization of Jesus's fellow sufferer and non-toxic man, men like Rabbi Akiva and his students Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Meir. Proposing solutions is always very much harder than identifying problems. How we can dismantle the associations between female virginity and purity, virtue and worth, and between penetrative sex and violence, these are not easy matters. Arguably, as with attitudes to divorce, same-sex marriage, reproductive choices, or gender reassignment, complexities are being plumbed and some sensitive progress is being made. One part of such explorations and progressions is recognizing what causes harm and how. The Bible's part in this requires acknowledgement and resistance. With Numbers 31 in particular, the viciousness of the text needs rigorous confrontation. A text like this cannot be excused with cultural relativist arguments or otherwise, and it cannot be ignored, given that rape and killings of vulnerable persons, the Rohingya, the Yazidi, the trafficked migrants desperate to come to Europe, are all too much like these voiceless Midianites. Speaking out, speaking about, and speaking back to such texts, if we are among the lucky ones to have the voice and the means and the forum, matters because it speaks back to power. Finally, the verb to weasel, it turns out, can mean to evade an obligation, duty, or the like, which makes weaseling an abuse of power. The noun, meanwhile, can refer either to a small carnivore that feeds mostly on smaller creatures or to a cunning, sneaky person. Sending scurrying the cunning and corrupt who evade their duty and live off overpowering and doing violence to those who are vulnerable remains pressing on many fronts. And in the Bible, or the Bible says so, must not be a place for a weasel to hide. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, there was so much in there. Wow. That was amazing. I particularly liked how I think you bring the world of the text to life. Speaking of the wedding night anxiety of Deuteronomy 22 and speaking about Numbers 31. I'm sure that someone's referred to Numbers 31 as a text of terror, but I think you have highlighted that it needs to be definitely engaged more. For those of you who would like to ask a question, I would just say start writing in the text, and I'll read it out. So if you have anything, you can start doing that now. We'll have 5 to 10 minutes of questions. Yeah, honestly, there's so much to say. I'm struggling to have a good question, not because it wasn't a good paper, but just because there's so much we can actually talk about.
A troublesome dog here, everybody. The joys of doing these things from home.
And a dog. This gets even better. This is amazing.
Yeah, I found it quite a hard paper to write in some ways too. Yeah, so thank you for listening.
Yeah, I wondered if maybe you could speak about, so with Numbers 31, part of your kind of talk was about, who takes power and who is left without power. Now, within Numbers 31, it's quite clear who is taking away power and whatnot. But I wonder, thinking about kind of the growth of a text over its various trade-ins, and maybe thinking about its post-exilic context, or wherever you want to date these texts. I wonder maybe if you could say a bit more about how a later dating of the text, where the authors and trade-ins don't have power per se.
It's almost like a fantasy, perhaps. Yeah, that's sometimes suggested, isn't it? So a kind of text of the powerless, like that other very violent psalm, by the rivers of Babylon. Is it 137? Where the awful conclusion of the dashing of the infants is sometimes seen as a kind of response to what's happened to the people themselves, and that's then projected onto a kind of violent fantasy of the powerless in response to brutalities committed. Yes, that is there. Is that something we want to encourage? I'm always relieved when I hear that the awful battles described in a book like Joshua, that archaeology suggests that they didn't take place in that kind of wholesale, large-scale violent way. Unfortunately for me, Brandon, dating texts is something I'm always really loath to do. I'm always so aware that, even if we can identify something about the time when a text was written, it was in all likelihood read and edited over such an expanse of time that it contains also traces from other times. But I do see some food for thought in your idea of looking at it as a text from a time that did not come from any kind of position of the power to do anything quite as dreadful as that. I see some, my screen is flitting. I see some comments there on the chat.
Yes. Yes, we have a question from Holly. She thanks you very much. I'm interested in what virginity means and represents, especially in relation to power. I'm especially intrigued by the notion of women's bodies and virginity as being like the forbidden fruit of knowledge, and of course, links between sex and knowledge in Hebrew. Do you think regulation of women's sexuality and fascination with female virginity is related to anxiety about female knowledge somehow? Is sexual violence some kind of response to this?
Oh, Holly, that's a really brilliant question. I am not ready with a profound answer to that, but I think you're absolutely onto something there. That that male anxiety is definitely wrapped up in all of this. Brilliant question. I want to mull on that much more. But I do think you're onto something there. I find it really interesting as I was reading my way into the subject that virginity can mean quite different things in different cultural settings, and whose preserve it is. For some it's a very personal thing, and for others it's much more a matter of a family, sometimes quite an extended family. So I found that very interesting. That it's not as clear cut as may seem. So I think there is an awful lot of kind of cultural exploration that has to go in towards giving you a full answer there. But I will mull on that, and I think it's a brilliant question.
Great. We have another question from Esther. She writes, you mentioned how usually bloodstaining is a sign of impurity, but on wedding nights it is desirable. Is this linked maybe to this being the time when the blood stain serves the man's purpose, i.e. that it legitimates his marriage or his manliness or his sexual conquest? Yeah,
that is a kind of sign that he was first, a kind of ownership of. I think you are onto something too, Esther. That's terrific. Yeah, these questions are so good because they get me thinking even more deeply about all of this. Yes, I think you're onto something with that. Would there still be an issue with purity if it were applied equally to males? Oh, yes, good question. There are some suggestions that circumcision and other rites that more often happen with teenage men are a kind of equivalent, almost done in competition with menstruation. I've heard that said, but again, something that takes a bit more thought. I always have that feeling after I give a paper of suddenly feeling like anything intelligent I could possibly say has vacated my head. So I'm really enjoying the questions, but I'm not quite ready with a very profound answer there.
I think Helen has a question.
It's not a question, actually. I wish I could. I'm so stunned, Johanna, that I can't ask a question. I just want to say how much I appreciated that. And I think it's a huge challenge, especially to those of us for whom this is a faith text. And I absolutely agree that we mustn't just kind of massage it away and try and excuse it. There's been too much of that has happened for too long. So I wholly agree with that. I'm particularly challenged and disturbed because I'm actually just starting out writing a commentary on Numbers, and I'm nowhere near Numbers 31 yet, but I have been starting to think about the Sotar a bit, which is just limbering me up for Judges for Numbers 31, I guess. So it's not a question, but just a huge appreciation. Thank you.
That's another really thought-provoking text, this Sotar text, isn't it? That's one about what to do if a woman is suspected of adultery. Another text I've worked on recently.
Johanna, I wonder, you mentioned something earlier in your paper about connecting virginity to whiteness. And I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more about if you had any additional insights about that.
It's just how, how profound it is. I mean, I know real scholars shouldn't do this, but if you go to Wikipedia and you look up virginity, okay, up pops this image by some French artist of a beautiful woman who signifies or personifies virginity. And she perfectly encapsulates that kind of web of associations I was talking about. You know, she's lily white. She's surrounded by these cherubs who, you know, coyly cover up their genitals. She's got a white robe on that, you know, keeps her very modestly covered. She's standing next to a Greek pot. So all these things about nobility and whiteness and purity and, you know, are kind of wrapped up in that image of the personified virginity. And we see it all over the place with you know, depictions of the Virgin Mary, you know, how very white her skin often is. Now, I know there are counter traditions too of Black Virgin Marys, but generally speaking, certainly in Western art, she is very much depicted as white, which is how Katie Edwards has written on this, hasn't she? But how Beyonce, with her kind of messing with that virgin imagery, created shockwaves, because it just shows how internalized those kinds of connections are for us. But there's more work to be done on that. But I think the associations between whiteness, including white skin, and purity and virginity run very, very deep. So there's a lot of kind of resisting of that needs to be done as well. Because it's profoundly damaging, isn't it, in terms of what it says about Black skin. So
we have, you know, I'm going to, I think we're going to call the Q&A or pause the Q&A, because at the end of our session, we'll have a larger time of Q&A. So if I didn't get to your question, I see them. I'm not ignoring them. They're great questions.
I'm excited for the next paper. So
yeah, we have. Yeah. I just want to make sure that we keep it on schedule, because we did start a little bit late. So we're going to break for 4 minutes. I was going to give you 5. I'm going to give you 4 minutes. Get your tea, whatever you're going to have, your lunch, your dinner. I don't know, wine. I don't know, whatever you want. Come back in 4 minutes, and we will start our next paper. All right, I know that maybe not all, I can't see all of you, so I don't even know if you're back, but hopefully you are back and you were just so engaged, you're just ready to soak in this knowledge. But so our next paper is from Siobhán Jolley, who is finishing up her doctoral work at the University of Manchester. She has a degree in theology from Oxford and a master's in Christianity and the arts from King's College, London. Her current research explores the feminist cultural reception of Mary Magdalene in art. She also has quite the passion for film and has written on visual portrayals of biblical women in TV shows such as Fleabag and Killing Eve. Her paper tonight is entitled "Some Women Were Watching: Traumatic Victimization and Female Witness to the Crucifixion." Siobhán.
Thank you. Has that worked? Yeah, happy days. We've got all our tech issues out the way. Great, right, I will jump straight in, but I'll say, just to speak to what Helen said at the start, that I'm conscious that although we're kind of in the academic arm of the centre at the moment, that hopefully some of what I say is kind of geared towards thinking about how we can put this into non-academic use as well. So, some women were watching: traumatic victimization and female witness to the crucifixion. Across the canonical Gospels, women are consistently identified as witnesses to Jesus' passion. This paper will utilise trauma theory as a heuristic lens to explore the potential impact of their exposure to this violence, considering how their traumatic victimization under patriarchy intersects with the experience. It will offer a reading of female witness to the crucifixion in light of our developing theologies of trauma, which can illuminate the text and provide a model for conscious consideration of gendered trauma in lived communities. So, introducing the lens of trauma. Simply understood, trauma is a state of psychological distress, influencing emotions and behaviours, usually in response to an external stimulus. It is etymologically rooted in the concept of wounding, and as Shelley Rambo notes, trauma frequently persists in symptoms that live on in the body. Judith Herman's 1991 work, Trauma and Recovery, marked the primary shift of the study of trauma from medicine and psychology into the wider domain, including in turn an increasing engagement between trauma studies and theology. Trauma-sensitive readings have proven a fruitful means of engaging biblical texts too, evident in different ways in the work of Shelley Rambo, Kirsty Cobb, and Adele Reinhardt, among others. Kathy Carruth's work in literary trauma theory has been broadly influential. Her account of trauma as something which cannot be directly represented has been criticised for its consideration of power dynamics by Victoria Burrows and an over-reliance on a specific causal framework by Greg Forter. Nonetheless, it remains formative in modelling nuance in trauma-informed reading of texts such as the Gospels. Carruth has highlighted trauma's insistent appearance outside the boundaries of any single place or time. This multiplicity serves as a reminder to attend to the subtleties and margins of the biblical text when reading through the lens of trauma, and to resist linear expectations of how and when trauma may be encoded in the narrative. Reading against the grain of the gospel text, i.e. not focusing on the Christological androcentric account that reads most easily, allows for new insights, informed by contemporary ideas which illuminate the text in a new way. One of the earliest exponents of applying trauma insights to biblical text, Daniel Smith Christopher, has rightly cautioned that care must be taken when acquainting ancient and modern societies, and warned against making definitive or global assertions based upon specific psychological studies. With this in mind, presenting this trauma-informed reading of the Women at the Passion is not to make anachronistic claims, to diagnose, or to assert historical reality. Rather, it aims to use the insights of trauma studies to consider the text anew, as we interpret it today. The study of trauma may be relatively new, but the phenomenon is not. Indeed, there's a cool irony to the correlation between dismissals of women's witness to the resurrection and the origins of trauma theorizing in studies of women in the 19th century by psychoanalysts such as Freud, all of whom have shared the appellation hysterical women. Patriarchy, power, and violence. Auerbach has described biblical texts as fraught with background, and any examination of women's experiences in the gospel must be considered against the backdrop of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a mix of privileges and oppressions that has formative impact on our lived experiences and the intellectual domain of knowledge formation that shapes those experiences. Though often addressed abstractly, its power constructions are concrete and at work in the way we think, act, and experience our embodied existence. However, as intersectionality as a critical framework illustrates, gender is only one of several ways in which individuals are included and excluded. In the context of the women in the Gospels, the intersection of patriarchy with imperialism is key. So an obvious but often overlooked factor that underpins our study of the women of the New Testament is the fact that we're reliant on the perspectives of men who are detached from the specific social location that the women occupy. It's important to note that this is a reading which reflects the reality of patriarchy rather than an indictment of Judaism in particular, a perspective which slides all too easily into supersessionism and anti-Semitic tropes. So when Talleyrand notes that patriarchy is the single most influential factor in determining Jewish women's position in the world of the New Testament, we must not overread the function of the adjective. The women's story is told through a patriarchal lens in narrative and narration, and so readings which seek to explore their story must be sensitive to this. Trauma-informed and feminist readings are united in their resistance to hegemonic powers that engage in harm. Patriarchy also contextualizes the violence in the gospel stories. As David Kleins has noted in various publications, the name for strength in action in traditional male terms is violence. Male violence remains at the forefront of contemporary discourse around patriarchy, both for those who highlight it as a specific societal problem and those who want to reiterate that not all men are perpetrators. The cornerstone of the latter position is to point out that men are frequently subjected to violence too, a point relevant to our purposes today as we see it in the Crucifixion. But I think this position fails to fully consider two key aspects of patriarchal violence that are important. Firstly, that regardless of the gender of the person subjected to violence, the gender of the perpetrator is overwhelmingly likely to be male. And secondly, that the hierarchical nature of a paradigm which centres particular male lives and experience as normative and superior depends on violence to maintain its structure and express the power claimed thereby. This necessarily others women, but also trans persons and those whose gender identity is fluid or sited outside the male-female binary. For anyone who's not centred and elevated under patriarchy, it is then a normatively traumatogenic institution. In Traumata, Mira Atkinson coins the neologism traumarchy to describe this way in which patriarchy perpetuates traumas, which she sees as manifest in racism, sexism, and violence. In so doing, she offers us a model which recognises the complex interaction between specific instances of violence, such as events like the crucifixion, the power structures which enable them, and the trauma that ensues as a consequence, which can be personal, cultural, and transgenerational. For women and others who do not form to the hegemonic model of masculinity, patriarchy is a source of traumatic victimization. Crucifixion, then, can be understood as an expression of toxic patriarchal power and an outpouring of masculinity, especially when understood in the context of Roman imperial violence. The repeated cycles of revolt and reconquest that characterize the Roman occupation of Palestine mean that, in Horsley's terms, Jesus pursued his mission in a historical period framed by imperial violence against the Judean and Galilean people and their repeated struggle for independence. As well as the gender distinction, Herodias is the outlier as a lone female perpetrator, the gospel narratives overwhelmingly present violence as being enacted by those in power. In Matthew, for example, Carter's demonstrated that violence by ruling elites predominates. So the women who witness the crucifixion, therefore, are familiar with an imperial hierarchy sustained by violence. As well as the literal brutality of crucifixion, the idealized imperial masculinity of Rome is elevated by the emasculation of its enemies. As pointed out by Alexiana and Wilson and plenty of others, Jesus' torture and death are constructed to compromise his masculinity by hegemonic standards. Glancy has argued that the ritualized stripping of masculinity in crucifixion would be clear to an ancient audience, regardless of the lack of graphic details in gospel accounts. This line of argument draws upon Walters, who reasons that public vulnerability and being unable to protect the body from violation runs contrary to Roman models of masculinity. And the very notion that being made less like a man, and thus more like a woman, as the ultimate debasement, not only makes the women's wider marginalisation clear, it also brings the association between masculinity and violence into sharper focus, as expressions and tools of patriarchal models of imperial power. The ideology of empire and the masculine ideal necessitates a feminized other. Women are explicitly others at the intersection of patriarchy and Roman imperialism, and violence is the means of their exclusion. Thus, in the moment of the crucifixion, the women are bearing witness not only to a violent reality in the present and all of the trauma that may entail, but also the fullest expression of a cultural ideology that is reliant upon their victimization. A trauma-informed reading of the Passion narratives therefore demands that we consider what the women's witness of Jesus' death means in an environment where they are the contingent objects of patriarchal violence. Trauma theory after Freud has typically conceptualized psychologically traumatizing events as punctual, i.e. like physical trauma, that there's a specific moment or series of moments that cause it. This is seen in Judith Herman's focus on atrocities, an umbrella term which incorporates a range of common traumatic events such as assault, and Kathy Carroll's exploration of overwhelming violent events. In the Passion narratives, as we'll see shortly, we're able to recognize a series of such punctual moments that might induce trauma for the women witnesses. Any one of these events, let alone their prompt succession, would constitute a traumatizing event. However, Forster rightly recognizes that trauma is not always induced by major extraordinary moments, but also by what he describes as the mundanely catastrophic. He notes traumas are also so chronic and cumulative, so woven into the fabric of our societies, that they cannot count as shocks. Following this description, it's clear that the habituation of women as the objects of violence under patriarchy is an example of naturalized trauma. This type of gendered cultural victimization does not rely on a punctual event, either to induce trauma or raise consciousness of it, but rather is an ongoing trauma as a result of their social exclusion. Though there is not a cataclysmic moment, as we recognize in their witness to the crucifixion, it's important to acknowledge the impact of this trauma too. To overlook that prolonged subjugation also invokes trauma responses is to naturalize the power systems that sustain it. More, whatever normalized violence these women are exposed to as both colonized people and women under patriarchy does not limit the trauma of their witness to the crucifixion. Instead, it compounds it. So let's turn to reading this through the lens of trauma. Eymann's description of trauma as a consequence of shocking occurrences which profoundly affect an individual's life might well have been written about what those present at Jesus' crucifixion witnessed. Yet, though crucifixion is fundamentally an expression of violence, as observed by Fleming Rutledge, this is not the aspect of Christ's death that takes up the most scriptural attention. When the violence is directly described, it is neither graphic nor emotive, and physical details are often passed over in favour of narrative, literary, and theological constructions. The sacrifice that the women witness is introduced largely in symbolic terms in the synoptic accounts of the Last Supper, when Jesus identifies that his body will be broken and blood will be spilled. The eschatological focus of interpreting these passages in the light of the resurrection can supersede the extremity of the physical sacrifice that is made. Yet the grueling details are still apparent as Jesus is beaten and spat at, forced to carry the implement of his execution, crucified, derided at his most vulnerable, and subject to a painful and public death. Aspects of trauma are also coded in plain sight in the narrative. The rending of the veil of the temple is an embodiment of the rupture of the symbolic order, which Hartman recognises as central to traumatic experiences. So across these passion accounts, there is an emphasis on female witness. John identifies 3 Marys at the foot of the cross by name, and Luke flags the presence of the women amongst the unlucky acquaintances. Matthew and Mark identify women witnesses as a distinct group. Greater focus on the trauma of the women calls attention to the reality of the violence that is being witnessed. The violence functions almost implicitly in the narrative because it is so familiar to us as readers, but the women witnesses are watching this being exhibited towards someone who they have followed, served, and developed a profound relationship with. Thinking with their wider traumatic victimization, it's clear that the almost throwaway line "some women were watching" overlooks the visceral experience of their witness. Nevertheless, this also aptly reflects the latency that often characterizes the psychological aspects of trauma. It's not always apparent in the moment of exposure, but frequently manifests later. Just as we might overlook the women's trauma in this moment by the incidental reference, so the full ramifications might not be recognized by survivors until later. As such, reading through the lens of trauma shows that while the little narrative space given to recognizing the witness of the women can underplay their significance, it does also reflect the way in which harm is not necessarily focused in that moment. Importantly, the act of witness alone can cause these women harm too. Dory Laub, a psychiatrist and trauma survivor, has observed that bearing witness even to the testimony of another's trauma has a material impact, where the witness comes to feel the bewilderment, injury, confusion, dread, and conflicts that the trauma victim feels. This comes in addition, therefore, to the personal trauma that the women are experiencing individually. Already, the complex repercussions of both direct and indirect exposure to violence are apparent. The women's trauma is uniquely compounded by their social location as women under patriarchy and colonized peoples, where, as noted previously, they're habituated to being the object in a culture of violence. As such, there's an additional traumatic burden of empathy. They are, in a very real sense, suffering alongside Jesus. Thus, the lens of trauma reminds us that the comment in Matthew and Mark that the women were looking on at a distance need not be a condemnation of their relationship with Jesus. It's possible for Jesus to be isolated and for the women to still feel close to him in their shared trauma. This is corroborated further by the fact that Mary Magdalene and at least one other woman are also witness to the burial. Just as John 13:1 notes that having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, so the women remain faithful witnesses to the end, despite their own suffering. An important model for engaging with trauma survivors more broadly also comes in the gospel accounts of the women's witness to the resurrection. The evangelists are ambiguous in their various descriptions of the women's alarm and upset. We tend to read this comfortably as an expression of their shock at the body's absence or Jesus' presence, but a trauma-sensitive reading confers recognition that these responses may also be a physical manifestation of their trauma. Trauma is materially compounded in the body, and the physical effects behave as if the trauma is current. Trauma triggers need not be in themselves upsetting, they only need to stimulate recall of a traumatic experience. So even returning to the tomb will necessarily recall their previous visit, witnessing his burial, and according to John 20:27, Jesus' body still bore the marks of his violent death. So a trauma response is not surprising. An effective case study in this regard comes through Shelley Rambo's exploration of trauma responses in John's account of Mary Magdalene's witness to the resurrection. Rambo argues that the Magdalene's weeping being noted twice in John 20:13 and 15 is not a condemnation of her hysteria, but rather a recognition that her witness is forged through her tears. Thus, where early critics such as Celsus regard the Magdalene dismissively as a half-frantic woman, Rambo instead recognises this as the impact of trauma. This trauma shapes her witness, but as affirmed later in the passage in verse 16, does not preclude its significance or validity. The same Magdalene who experienced the compounded trauma at the foot of the cross is the first witness to the resurrection for John, and thereby the first bearer of the core message of Christianity. This status of the Magdalene or the women as crucial first witnesses serves to illustrate that traumatic experiences of violence, which have enduring physical and psychological effects, do not invalidate those who survive them. Through the lens of trauma, the hearers of this story are left with a choice. Do we act akin to those who ensure women are disbelieved, disregarded, and displaced because of their trauma? Or are we willing to accept them in their full and complex humanity and hear what they have to say? It's also really important to note that the women's trauma is not fixed in some sense by the resurrection. In both Broken Bodies and Ruptured Voices, Karen O'Donnell discusses the personal individual nature of processing trauma in its aftermath. The joy of the resurrection does not immediately negate the trauma of the crucifixion. It is an external, additional, and separate experience. Thus, when the joy of the resurrection is a source of liturgy, preaching, and catechesis, it must not be a source of denial of the experience of trauma survivors either. So just to offer some quick conclusions. A trauma-informed reading of the canonical Passion accounts foregrounds the ways in which these women witnesses are the embodiment of discipleship. Even in their act of witness, these are women who are picking up the cross. Such a reading is not to glorify their trauma or to compete it somehow with Jesus' suffering. Rather, it recognises adjacently the immense personal cost of this discipleship. With this in mind, the conclusion of their narrative arc with criticism and disbelief seems all the more damning. It also makes a mockery of the excuse for the male disciples' desertion that there was no risk for the women by their presence. Overall, a trauma-informed reading of these texts has clear benefits for their interpretation and application. From a feminist point of view, it allows us to recognise the significance of the women in a narrative where they are never the focus, and explore details of the text without resorting to patriarchal tropes of hysteria. Cheryl Exham's analogy of women being raped by the pen is apposite here. This type of resistant reading pushes back at the subjugation of women and their experiences inherent in the mode and substance of their description. More, it forces us to think critically about how we engage with violence and the wider impact on those who are exposed to it. In a specific way, it demands reconsideration of how we engage with those who have suffered violence and trauma, especially in relation to how we handle gospel accounts of Jesus' suffering. Some women were watching, and some are watching still.
Wow, thank you so much, Siobhán. There's so much in there as well. We already have a question from Kiersey, and I'm pretty sure I mispronounced your name, Kiersey. I'm very sorry. But she says, thank you for this brilliant paper, very enlightening. Could you please expand on the point that the women standing at a distance is not necessarily an indictment on them? You mentioned something about the woman and Jesus being together in their shared trauma, which was, I had the same question. So
yeah, so I think what I mean by that is that there's sometimes a sense that the inclusion of that detail that they're at a distance can feel almost like a little bit of a dig, like they're there, but they're not really there. So it's also fine that no one else is there either. But actually, I think if you look at it through this way and think about what's going on for them, they are very there. It doesn't matter whether they're stood right at the foot of the cross like you have in John, or whether they're stood wherever Mark and Matthew want to put them, but they are having a physical experience just in a comparable or at least adjacent way, I think.
So reading that sentence through trauma theory really bridges the distance that is in the text then.
Yeah, exactly. I think because we're often kind of picking through the bones of the text to find stories of women, when we've got something that allows us to kind of expand on it without sort of requiring us to do too many sort of mental gymnastics. And I think it's a really useful way of sort of expanding what is present in the text.
Thank you. We have another question from Helen. She says, thank you so much, Siobhán. That was very thought-provoking. Could you comment on the idea, I think I read somewhere, that the early church is characterized and shaped by its shared trauma? Does this extend beyond the first generation?
Yeah, so this is a kind of, it's picked up in a few different ways, and probably the example that kind of leaps to mind for me is Adele Reinhardt, who takes a reading of imagining the Johanna community in this way. I think even if you take the line that these texts are this narrative expression of trauma and working through it, I'm cautious about the idea of it extending beyond the first generation, because I worry that kind of experience, I think it is distinct in some way. And I don't necessarily feel comfortable with the idea of suggesting that there's some sort of traumatic inheritance in Christianity that is in any way materially comparable to the hyper-traumatic experiences that people have in a very immediate and personal sense. And I do think it's different to other transgeneration and cultural traumas, because regardless of little pockets of it, for the most part, Christians don't share that experience of trauma, danger, and persecution. And so I think I'm kind of a little bit resistant to looking at beyond that, just because I feel like that does a bit of a disservice to some other experiences.
Okay, we have a final question for now, at least, from John. Very helpful approach. A question about gender dynamics. I was fascinated by the idea that Jesus suffering could be read as a demasculinization or feminization. The thought comes to mind that in early Christian tradition, the stories of female martyrs are elevated in heroic ways. Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example. I wonder what gender dynamics are at play when these female martyrs are venerated early in the tradition. An open question, perhaps you have thoughts and comments, which I'm sure you do.
I do. You've opened a can of worms there, John. I'm going to be emailing you all kinds now, spamming you. Yeah, so this idea is picked up in lots of different things, both in a historical context and more in a sort of biblical studies context. And probably the place that I'd send you to for that is Brittany Wilson, as something that's kind of really readable and engaging. But it crops up in loads of different ways, and I think David Toombs is here, so he's kind of explored that further in relation to sexual violence, and so there's lots of mileage in that. I think what's interesting when you look at those early female martyrs is that their heroism, I think, is masculized, and even if we just think about like cutting off of hair and things like that, and the kind of symbols that are encoded there. So I do think those gender dynamics are still sustained, but I think one of the reasons that those female martyrs are so interesting is because just by their existence, they're kind of pushing back at it, even if the narratives themselves are shaped to masculinize them in their valor.
Thank you, Siobhán. All right, moving right along. Our next paper is from Hannah Baylor, who is a PhD student in theology and Christian ethics at Oxford University. Her research is about the theology of sexual consent. She was a 2019 finalist for the Theology Slam, where she presented on theology and the #MeToo movement. She has recently written for the Shiloh Project with an interesting post entitled "Kissing Purity Culture Goodbye." Hannah is also training for ordination in the Church of England at Wycliffe Hall, and she is almost done. She's about to be ordained in about a month, so a very exciting time for her. Her paper for this evening is entitled "By Tamar, by Rahab, by Ruth, by the Wife of Uriah." a hashtag #MeToo reading of Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. Hannah.
Great, thank you so much. I don't quite know how to follow those two exceptional papers. They were fascinating. So if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. The story will be familiar to many of us. In the wake of allegations of sexual assault made against Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein, Me Too began trending across social media platforms as hundreds, then thousands, then millions used the hashtag to identify themselves as survivors of sexual violation in its myriad forms. Me Too has evolved into a shorthand, on the one hand encouraging survivors to come forward and challenge their perpetrators, and on the other, a pejorative to resist desired reforms of the movement and to peddle facile criticisms of it, such as it making dating impossible or killing off the office Christmas party. Me Too resists easy definitions of its scope and its purpose. Johanna Stiebert captures the movement's multi-purpose character. It was first about exposing the problem of widespread sexual violation, and second about gathering support for tackling the injustices. She also points to the growing criticisms of the Me Too movement, its lack of inclusiveness and intersectionality, the power illiteracy of its privileged and high-profile proponents, and how the originator of the phrase Me Too, Tarana Burke, feels the movement is unrecognisable from her pre-existing activism. With these criticisms in mind, my definition of a Me Too reading, which I adopt for this paper, involves raising awareness of sexual abuse in its multifarious forms, the hearing of stories, paying particular attention to and elevating the experiences of the most powerless, embracing discomfort and challenge as the hearer, understanding that being trusted with stories is a gift, not a right, and recognising that with that greater awareness comes a growing command to pursue justice. In short, my hope as a Me Too lens is attentive, compassionate, humble, and dynamic. I'm also a Christian ethicist, not a biblical scholar, although we of course share a core text in the Bible, but I do come with the priorities of the former, namely how we bring together the deontic command of God and the formation of our moral character to live the ethical life in pursuit of the good. In the realm of sexual violation, to be adequate, Christian moral reflection must begin with real experience, not with romantic fantasies. A Me Too reading resists any idealistic or romantic understanding, following God's command to pay attention to the reality of sin and to embrace the disquieting of my own status quo as the encounter with sin's reality and God's command directs the trajectory of my moral formation. Thus, my purpose for this paper is twofold, offering a Me Too reading of the Matthean genealogy, and then suggesting how such a reading meets the field of Christian ethics, each informing the other as they attend the topic of sexual violation and its concomitant issues. So the genealogy of Jesus, as recorded in Matthew 1:1-17, is notable for its inclusion of 4 women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, that is Bathsheba. In different ways, these 4 women can all be said to have their own Me Too stories. First, Tamar in Genesis 38. Her first husband, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Tamar is then married off to her brother-in-law, Onan, who denied her reproductive justice by deliberately spilling his semen. Returned to her father's house, her father-in-law, Judah, mistakes her for a prostitute, sleeps with her, and impregnates her. When Judah learns of Tamar's pregnancy, he demands she be burned for what he perceives as her promiscuity. But he is chastened when she proves he is the one who impregnated her. Tamar's Me Too story is manifold. She suffers mistreatment at the hands of her intimate partners, and she is subject to slut shaming and punishment due to her sexuality. Moreover, Tamar's story highlights the hypocrisy of her perpetrator's actions. Judah treating her as property to be controlled on the one hand and exploited on the other. Judah's actions articulate what Will Gaffney describes as the disdain Israel has for sex workers among its own women, while permitting its men to seek sex workers of other national and ethnic identities. Tamar's story can be heard as one of coercive control and the justification of abuse when it is aimed at an other. Second, Rahab, who in Joshua 2 assists the Israelites in capturing the city of Jericho. In discussions of what unites the women of the Matthean genealogy, some scholars suggest that what Tamar, Rahab, and Bathsheba share is sexual sinfulness. Such an interpretation is a classic example of an androcentric exegesis, which associates women with sexuality, connects sexuality with sin, and shuts eyes to the far from irreproachable conduct of many men in the genealogy. They mould Rahab to this reading solely upon her being a prostitute, making various sexist assumptions. First, that it is something that she might have freely chosen. Second, that she exercises that role somehow in a vacuum. And third, with no textual evidence that she is doing anything sinful, especially given the Israelite code of ethics, whose adherents were content to use women as prostitutes, but were condemnatory of their character. Richard Davidson. With the exception of her mention in the Matthean genealogy, Rahab's appearances in the New Testament assign her the epithet of harlot. She is defined through judgments about her sexuality, perceived as honourable despite her actions. Her Me Too story is one of microaggressions which accumulate as part of rape culture, where prevailing norms and attitudes and misogynistic practices are validated and rationalised through various acts of sexism. As one linguist points out, if you want to insult a woman, call her a prostitute. Rahab's Me Too may not be the most egregious, but it highlights the rape culture which enables sexism to flourish and escalate. Third, the story of Ruth. Three interpretations of her story as sexual violence are usually offered. First, Ruth is a victim of sexual violation in the sense that she is vulnerable to it and must take precautions to protect herself. Boaz warns her not to leave the field she is in and instructs the other men not to harass her. The implication is that Ruth is vulnerable to the behaviour of other men. She has to boundary her movements and actions to preserve her safety. This interpretation highlights the accumulative toll of emotional labour and enculturation into constant fear, which binds women who are forced to operate in a way that is diametrically opposed to their pursuit of freedom. A second reading of Ruth's story assesses the power imbalance between Ruth and Boaz, problematising their relationship as one of inequality. And a third reading, posited by Will Gaffney, argues Ruth is a victim of what she calls sexploitation by her mother-in-law Naomi, who pushes her into sexual servitude. Ruth's Me Too story enables us to hear a range of stories and experiences, all of which are encompassed by the movement. And finally, the story of Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11-12. The reception history of Bathsheba is often unfaithful to the biblical narrative. Leonard Cohen portrays her as performatively sensual. Sebastiano Ricci paints her naked as a blatant exhibitionist. And in the film, David and Bathsheba, she is written as David's stalker. Although presented neutrally in the text, her actions have been twisted by some to conform her to the sexual temptress trope. For example, according to one scholar, being deliberately provocative by bathing near the palace. Yet this overlooks David's actions. It is his palace providing the vantage point to see her. It is his gaze which finds Bathsheba when she has taken herself away to engage in purificatory rituals. He sends messengers to bring her to him, and he sleeps with her. Given the power dynamic and all that we know about sexual consent, it is hard to read consensuality into Bathsheba's actions. Upon my hearing, her Me Too story is one of rape. This is just a cursory hearing of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba's Me Too stories, but they reveal the absence of homogeneity in Me Too experiences. They also demonstrate the scope of a systemic lack of sexual justice, especially for women, and within that, women who are in any way considered other. Through their presence in the Matthean genealogy, the stories of these women are inexorably linked with the incarnation in Jesus Christ. I want to suggest two major ways in which a Me Too reading of the genealogy aids Christian ethics in its understanding of and response to sexual violation as experienced by these women and many others since. Specifically, a Me Too reading is both silence breaking and justice bringing. So in 2017, Time magazine named as its Person of the Year the Silence Breakers. They were film stars, pop stars, activists, hospital workers, politicians, dishwashers, strawberry pickers. They were white, black, Hispanic, Asian, women and men, straight and LGBT, named and anonymous. Their stories ran the gamut of the Me Too spectrum. They were silence breakers, not only for themselves, but vicariously for all those with Me Too stories. In a similar vein, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba are vicarious silence breakers, not just for those in the Hebrew Bible who have Me Too stories, but for all who identify with them. Just as Time silence breakers are united and representative of others with Me Too stories, so are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba representative silence breakers. The incarnation is God's revelation of himself. Me Too stories have likewise been described as revelations. So in the Matthean genealogy, these two forms of revelation come together. The incarnation is an establishment of relations between God and human beings. As Rowan Williams notes, the human person engaged in relation by Jesus is connected to the word of God in and through that relation. And depending on the condition and orientation of that person, such a connection may bring both promise and judgment. For those who can say Me Too, it brings the promise that their suffering has been noticed, their experience is heard. The Hebrew Bible stories of texts of terror do not lose relevance just because there is now a New Testament. The injustice against them is condemned, and it can also provide survivors, victims, with contemporary survivors and victims with a hermeneutic of suspicion for approaching the Christian gospel when so much sexual violation has been perpetrated in the Christian gospel's name. God has never been silent on the worthiness of flesh, but the incarnation breaks any doubt of his silence on it. As Michael Lloyd notes, what dignifies us most as a species is that God became one of us. It gives us a dignity and a sanctity of which we would not otherwise dream. In the juxtaposition in the genealogy of degraded and abused flesh and the flesh of God incarnate as the Christ child, silence is broken on the extent to which humanity has departed from God's vision of love for his human creation. The Me Too genealogy demonstrates that the incarnation does not forget what has come before, rather that what has happened, in this case sexual injustice, has been noticed by God, and he is not finished with that problem. But the silence breaking of the incarnation also warns of judgment for perpetrators which cannot be evaded. Walter Brueggemann states that the primary purpose of silence breaking is to challenge those afforded power by the status quo, but just who and what constitutes the status quo is contestable. One of the criticisms of Me Too is that it may unintentionally help perpetrators of sexual abuse by normalising abuse or by caricaturing perpetrators as monsters against whom, to quote Johanna Stiebert, regular variety perpetrators might compare themselves favourably. However, the incarnation as a precursor of God's ultimate judgment breaks this silence, holding perpetrators accountable for their sin, whatever its form. As Jesus warns, nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. Tamar and Bathsheba's abusers are named. They cannot extricate their abuse from their legacies. They are still subject to judgment. This should disquiet us, compel us to search ourselves for any complicity, oblige our own silence breaking for how we may have abetted the status quo. When Bathsheba is quasi-erased as the wife of Uriah, the lack of full revelation of her story functions as a reminder that the work of silence breaking is far from over. No longer can we either simply enjoy a sanitized Christmas story with just a shadow of the tragedy for Jesus to come. We are reminded of the tragedies of sin from the past. The Me Too genealogy is silence breaking for those women and all they represent. It constitutes a breaking of God's silence concerning the divinely sanctioned dignity of flesh, and a silence breaking of Christian ethics on addressing the issue, and highlights the ongoing need for silence breaking around sexual abuse and injustice. In her moving, visceral and arguably prophetic victim impact statement at the sentencing of her abuser, the gymnast, lawyer, and abuse survivors advocate Rachel Den Hollander addressed the man who had abused her and hundreds of others. She said in part, "In our early hearings, you brought your Bible into the courtroom. You spoke of praying for forgiveness. But Larry, if you have read the Bible you carry, you know forgiveness does not come by doing good things, as if good things can erase what you have done. It comes from repentance, which requires facing and acknowledging the truth about what you have done in all its utter depravity and horror, without mitigation, without excuse. The Bible you carry says it is better for a millstone to be thrown around your neck and you thrown into a lake than for you to make even one child stumble. And you have damaged hundreds. The Bible you carry speaks of a final judgment where all of God's wrath in its eternal terror is poured out on men like you. Should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing." So Den Hollander speaks to a future justice, the eschatological promise that the whole earth will face God's justice. The Matthean genealogy is concerned with establishing Jesus as descended from the royal Davidic line in accordance with various messianic prophecies. It confirms Jesus's earthly and cosmic soteriological significance. Through the flesh-affirming incarnation, flesh-glorifying resurrection, and flesh-exalting ascension, flesh received justice. It signifies that God did not come just into the world to save sinners, but actually to restore the sinned against. It is justice for Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and all they represent, that justice ultimately will prevail. However, the Me Too genealogy reminds us that the inbreaking of God's justice is not only anticipation of a future justice, but an active justice, a justice requiring action now. And actually, it's too late in terms of all the historic cases. The Me Too genealogy demonstrates that for sexual violation, God's justice bringing through Christ begins at the manger. In an Advent sermon, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says of Christ's birth, "The judgment and redemption of the world, that is what is happening here." He continues, "For those who are great and powerful in this world, there are two places where their courage fails them, which terrify them to the very depths of their souls, and which they dearly avoid. They are the manger and the cross of Jesus Christ. No one who holds power dares to come near the manger. King Herod also did not dare." But through the genealogy, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and of course Mary, who I can't incorporate in this paper, are as close as it is possible to be to the manger. Ian Clements argues, and by their presence in the genealogy, they serve to anticipate the Matthean Messiah's concern for those who are structurally marginalised. They also provide a hint that the future community of disciples the Messiah gathers to follow him will be differently comprised. With the urgency of a Christian ethicist, I want to go further and suggest that Jesus' justice-bringing ministry begins with the issue of sexual violation because this issue is present at his birth. It is not deferred until his public ministry. The Me Too genealogy demonstrates God's justice bringing for survivors of sexual violation, and the institution of the order of sexual justice amidst the chaos of injustice begins at the manger. In the act of love which the incarnation embodies, it is an exercise of justice which involves not treating people as objects but as people, and this recovers a sense of dignity that can be lost when justice is devoid of this realm of attention in personal and political ways, such as sexual violation. The Me Too genealogy situates us in the realm of attention to bodies and to the systems and cultures which denigrate, abuse, and deny justice to bodily integrity. This attention causes us to notice the injustice, notice God's condemnation on injustice, and God's rightness and right-directedness, which then makes demands on our own right-directedness. I think I'm going over time. How am I doing?
If you would wrap it up, that'd be great.
Great. I will just wrap it up there. There are loads of things I can't include, and I've just got the chat pinging at me. So I will just stop there.
Do you want to have a final sentence or something?
Silence breaking, justice bringing, potentially useful for Christian ethics.
That's great. That's brilliant. I was going to say those are these points that stick out to me as well. And honestly, we have so much going on in the chat. We got some sarcasm. from one of our presenters. That's fun. But no shame, no shame. Sarcasm is all fun. And we're all friends here, so it's good. I think I think we should really respond to Helen's question about within the genealogy in Matthew, we have another male victim of sexual abuse, Jacob, and 3 male abusers, Abraham, Judah, David, most likely, and definitely Solomon in my reading. How does this fit in with what you are presenting?
Yeah, so in my lovely massive PhD thesis, I have all the space to make all those comments. So yeah, it makes a far more holistic understanding of what we mean by justice and what we mean by redemption. So yes, frustratingly cursory reading of the genealogy. I'm really sorry, I promise in my footnotes, which is no use to a presentation like this. But yes, that's really important in terms of, you know, justice in Christian ethics is a really complicated topic because you always want to prioritize justice for who has been sinned against. But there is this form of justice for those who are sinners that actually they can receive redemption. And that's such a minefield in so many spheres, particularly sexual violation. So I was also being a bit of a coward in terms of not incorporating that this evening. I'm very sorry.
No, it wasn't a criticism, Hannah, at all. It was just a kind of musing on what you were saying. So thank you.
Yeah, and I see the Mary point as well. Yes, again, I've got a very lovely, fat, juicy footnote in here about Mary and about just how consensual the Annunciation is. That's, again, could be a whole paper on its own. And there's lots of talk amongst scholars about how Mary, so she shares many qualities with these women, you know, in terms of having a risky, societally unacceptable pregnancy, for example. But then, you know, she's married with this legacy where all generations will call me blessed. That incredible song of justice she has in the Magnificat in Luke's Gospel. So she's a fascinating juxtaposition of, you know, a woman who otherwise would have had so many people trying to denigrate her and do her down. And yet she is absolutely revered in the Christian tradition. So again, she has this fascinating texture to how we read the genealogy.
This is great. Honestly, we could probably have so many more questions, but I want to move on to our final paper, and then hopefully we'll have a bit more time at the end for more questions. But thank you so much for this paper, Hannah. So moving right along, if I can find there we go. So our final paper is from Alexiana Fry, who is a PhD student in Old Testament at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Before that, she received her MDiv from Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. Her current research focuses on trauma hermeneutics, feminist theory, migration studies, and applying all those to the book of Judges and Hosea. And very, very impressively, she's recently signed a book contract with Lexington Press on speech act theory and trauma, which I think will come out in a few years, but still very exciting. Her paper this evening is entitled The Lucky Victim, Current Rape Narratives and the Virgin Daughter of Judges 19. Alexiana.
Hello all. Sorry, Hannah, for being obnoxious in the chat box while you were presenting, but there it is. It's truly an honor to be here today and also to present alongside all of these amazing papers that I feel like have really, really wonderful overlap. So good job, conference organizers. I'll begin. Once again, my paper title is The Lucky Victim, Current Rape Narratives in the Virgin Daughter of Judges 19. The uprising of memoirs and testimonies that are breaking the silence in the midst of the burgeoning culture of #MeToo have been both damning and simultaneously empowering. What was once a trickle of willingly unheard stories has become a tidal wave that is not to be ignored, a true reckoning of the devastation that occurs when abuse and the ideologies that perpetuate abuse go unchecked. Yet, the aforementioned trickle still involves the plethora of narratives that contain these violent abuses, needing to be revisited, such as the story of Judges 19. While recent commentators, hi Helen, have done a great job amplifying this story, the only victim in the story typically that is discussed is the concubine. She, however, is not the only one in the story who is victimized. And no, this is not a paper discussing the potential victimhood of the Levite. Scholars have rarely mentioned anything about the other woman in the dark tale, the virgin daughter of the old man. While the Levite's potential victim status has been mentioned in scholarship, this survivor is often left out. She, like the concubine, is silent in the text, barely there, except for a key moment in which everything changed for her. She is one of two women readily offered up to the men of wickedness outside her home, but offered up by her own father. In using the words written by Alice Sebold in her own post-abuse memoir to give voice to the daughter, quote, "My life was over. My life had just begun," end quote. Using a feminist lens, this paper will explore the real implications of purity culture in ancient Near Eastern contexts, specifically in the text of Judges 19, as well as in our current context. From these findings, the paper will show how this ideology carried out not only perpetuates and goes hand in hand with rape culture, creating a blame-shifting narrative that escalates into the creation of a hierarchy of victimhood. Both rape culture and purity are constructs that other, ultimately as tools of the patriarchy. This paper will reread the text of Judges 19, while abhorrent and grotesque, as still a subversive narrative that critiques these contexts and ideologies, begging for others to hear the silenced and thus bear witness for repentance and change. Rape is a weapon of power and violence, not necessarily one of sexuality, though it involves sex. In regard to rape culture, it is, as Roxane Gay remarks in her anthology on the subject, quote, "What it is like to live in a culture where it often seems like it is a question of when, not if, a woman will encounter some kind of sexual violence," end quote. Within the same anthology, Lynn Melnick writes of her own experience of this that is often overlooked. She was holding hands with her daughter outside of the library before leaving to go home. Ben is catcalled, using words I do not necessarily feel comfortable adding to the pages of this document. The offender speeds away after offending her, after objectifying her, and making her feel entirely unsafe. Her story continues. Quote, "I turn around and make eye contact with a cop standing outside the library. I gesture to him like, 'What the hell?' And he gestures back like, 'What can you do?' I don't know. You're just a cop and someone made me feel unsafe on the street. Never mind. I was wearing a sundress. It's not like he touched you. It's not like he hurt you. It's not like he raped you. I'm supposed to be grateful because I wasn't raped," end quote. In rape culture, there are no consequences for these actions. These actions that are violent towards those who receive them are excused away, at least the refrain of the day, normal behavior. Even in the proverbial tidal wave that is seemingly happening currently, too few people are actually convicted for rape itself. Rape culture is so deeply enmeshed with the supposed justice system, in which a biased rationale is created, used, and accepted for why Lynn deserved to get catcalled. Why? She wore a sundress. What happened was not that bad. For this reason, among others, there is an unknown and large amount of people who do not disclose their abuse. However, we are making an unfortunate connection today between rape culture and purity culture that needs further discussion, especially in regard to how it is wielded using biblical texts in sacred spaces and places. To attempt to define purity culture, Katie Cross, in her study on the trauma of purity culture, writes that, quote, "Generally speaking, purity culture manifests most clearly in conservative Christian communities. It is deeply ensconced and established in evangelical traditions. The central tenets of purity culture include, but are not limited to, the restriction of all sexual activity to heterosexual marriage, an emphasis on modesty and sexual purity, an abstinence-only education, end quote. What's important in Cross's research is that she connects this to something she calls body theodicy, arguing that it can be understood as something that becomes trapped or embedded in women's bodies as a result of purity culture. The above definition has been coded in fear-based metaphors to those who may cross these lines, becoming chewed up gum and stomped on roses, explicitly unwanted by anyone. This ideology also does not account for abuse. The irony is that the ideology claims to be protecting those who adhere to it, but it ultimately places blame and responsibility on women and their bodies for whatever could, rather will, occur. The shame created by this theology and ideology impacts real bodies. For this reason, Emily Joy Allison calls purity culture the spiritual corollary of rape culture, and that this shame makes abuse that has already occurred worse, and actually sets the stage for abuse to be more widespread than it otherwise would be, as silence is better than speaking up when these are the rules. What is striking about this statement on purity culture, especially as it is mainly upheld in evangelical circles, is the notion that these spaces are supposed to be safe havens, even countercultural, especially for the most vulnerable. Yet Beth Allison Barr notes that it is essentially these tools of the patriarchy, particularly ones that work to keep women's voices silent, that are actually a copycat of the world we live in today. She writes, "My modern students balk at how Babylonian law allowed husbands to drown their wives for alleged adultery. But my students are also living in the state of Texas, in which women make up 94% of the victims in domestic partner murder-suicides. Not to mention the United States, in which almost 25% of women have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. This evidence shows not only the continuity of patriarchy from ancient Mesopotamia to modern America, but also the continuity of its dark underbelly." Barr continues to show examples of how the methods and madness of the patriarchy have shape-shifted throughout the decades, including what she calls sanctifying purity, a move that came out of 19th century anxieties of social and economic changes, a firm reminder that patriarchy moves hand in hand to uphold militarism, racism, oppression, and hierarchy. Well-known researchers on purity culture, Jessica Valenti and Sarah Maslener, agree wholeheartedly in that many of these anxieties in the modern ages involving purity culture came out of white anxieties, a significant strategy for evangelicals facing the gain or loss of their own cultural capital, linking sexual deviancy and national decline, and of course, declining Anglo-Saxon privilege. Levon Proverbs Biggs, who works with women of color who are survivors of sexual assault, specifically mentions purity culture in an interview with Allison as steeped in white supremacy, as the image that comes up for the virtuous woman, as was said earlier, is white and chaste. Black women's bodies have been hypersexualized for millennia. Bifurcating women of all colors into pure and maternal via the cult of domesticity, where then one easily demonizes prostitutes and sex work, those on the other side of the binary, or simply for wearing a sundress, has been patriarchy's tool that has kept women under the thumb of subordination, their bodies homes for trauma, following them unto death, even more so for women of color and sexual minorities. Melnick finishes her chapter in the anthology by adding, quote, "Once or twice in my life, I swear to you, I've done things other than be a body available for men to enjoy or reject. But I know I have no right to complain. I'm lucky. I've been allowed one more day as a woman on this earth, relatively unviolated. Shouldn't that be enough? Lucky, lucky, lucky," end quote. Seeing these ideologies then operating in an infamous rape text in the Hebrew Bible is rather seamless. Judges 19 is the story of a concubine who leaves her husband for abundantly speculated reasons, namely due to the verb used to describe her act of leaving, zonah, another word for prostituting, unfaithful. Later in the story, she is gang raped by the citizens of Gibeah and then dismembered by her own spouse. In tandem with the already exhausted conversations on rape culture in this specific text, Isabella Hamley poses the question, would she be less of a victim had she been promiscuous? Rape culture answers yes to this question, alongside many commentators and scholars who participate in the violent act that Cheryl Exum calls being raped by the pen. The blame for her zonaing in the beginning of the narrative thus merits the horrifying acts that happen to the concubine. Yet Hamley also poses this as a challenging question to even feminist interpreters, who explain readily that the term in this context obviously means that she left him due to abuses. Being unfaithful only means going back to her father's house. It doesn't mean prostituting. Even feminists are so steeped in patriarchal culture that they seek to make her pure enough so that she didn't deserve the act of gang rape and dismemberment to occur. And using the words of Lacey Crawford, who herself was unbelieved in her own rape case due to the fact that she had been sexually active at the time, quote, "To believe in the perfect victim is to believe in no victim at all," end quote. Again, she is not the only victim in this story. The virgin daughter, her very name giving the title favored in a patriarchal society, is also objectified and offered to the men of wickedness outside her home, which is supposed to be safe, by her own father. She certainly doesn't die, she doesn't get raped, she doesn't get touched. In this comparison, she's certainly lucky. But as Crawford notes, it's a bitter term, evidence of how the same words have different meanings to a victimized woman and a world inclined to deny trauma. It is Crawford who actually compares her own story to Siebold's, as she envies her for not only being attacked by a stranger as opposed to the attacker that she knew, she also envies Siebold's virginity, as that gift of innocence stolen would make her more favorable in court. This paper does not want to dismiss any form of trauma, even if what occurred is not that bad in comparison. Lyra Van Cleef-Stephanon writes a poem based on this chapter from the point of view of the women. And as the virgin daughter looks on as the concubine is thrown out, she speaks 3 times over, "It could have easily been me. Lucky, lucky, lucky." Relationally, there are many breakdowns between each of the members in this story, but most particular in the case of the virgin daughter between herself and her father. Miki Ball adds that there's an intrinsic bond between the idea of virginity, the competition between fathers and next generation men, and the extreme violence that takes the form of ritual sacrifice. In the eyes of the patriarchal context, she is the best and most pure sacrifice, highly desired. The virgin is the same side of the binary for women besides wife and mother, inhabiting a space of the complementary ideal of the feminine, described erotically as ripe and unblemished fruit. Phyllis Bird continues that this is simply the same ideal viewed from the perspective of male control underlying the legal stipulations regarding women's sexuality. Unfortunately, when this occurs, there is the creation of a narrative and systems that affirm that there are women who do not deserve to be raped, and some be those on the other end of the binary who do. The virgins are both desired and protected to some relative degree, seen as innocent. Within rape culture and purity culture, the question must be asked, what did the virgin daughter do to deserve this? Van Cleef-Stephanon's poem starts the daughter's portion of the poem with the very words, "Suddenly I am a stranger in my father's house." For the father to offer his daughter up, unmarried, virginal, would mean that she would potentially have to marry the rapists who are pounding at the door, which remains wide open to them. This, for obvious reasons, not ideal for more likely all parties concerned, except for maybe the father, in that he is absolved of some roles and costs in the daughter's life. He essentially others his own daughter for what seems could be his own benefit. Julia O'Brien, in her book that discusses problematic metaphors, most often in prophetic texts, says that in this patriarchal context, to be forever a daughter is to remain ever dependent on and vulnerable to others, defenseless when those in control fail to offer protection and care. Ironically, there is not much of a difference between the elderly male host and the father of the concubine, 2 men who are mainly contrasted by commentators via in their modes of hospitality. But they both fail to protect their daughters, seeking instead to protect the Levite, the man, the guest. Some attempt to make a case in using the parallel narrative in Genesis 19, debating the honor and shame codes of ancient Near Eastern patriarchal contexts said to keep women safe, but really only control them and make them expendable in protecting the male figures. Mitzi Smith speaks on patriarchal societies and the ownership of women's bodies in light of Judges 19, stating, quote, "Patriarchal societies teach that it is the right of men to have access to women's bodies to satisfy their desires, that their rage is justified when what they've been taught they are entitled to is not given freely. Rape is an act of hostility and violence and not a crime of passion, even and especially when men and women rape their wives or traffic and expose their wives and daughter to others in order to protect their own bodies and manhood," end quote. Arguing within this passage as the interplay of patriarchal ideologies rear their ugly head does not have to be an either-or conversation, where then the men must be the ones willing to be harmed on behalf of the women inside the home. Rape and violence must be resisted and abolished everywhere, where it doesn't happen to anyone. A feminist ethos seeks to see and hear those who are unseen and unheard, and it is of great necessity to notice that God himself identifies with the women in this passage. While seemingly nowhere to be found, God implements a silence that protests. I interpret this passage as an ideological indictment towards the patriarchal context that perpetuates these actions, ones that create hierarchies of fabricated worthiness. Exum adds, it is men in this story who bring death and who shift the blame onto women through an encoded message that holds women responsible for male aggression. So this would not be the time to add the hashtag not all men. Resisting the patriarchy benefits everyone. Famously, the chapter ends by stating what I view as ironic given a whole reading of Judges, but something to still yet heed. Think her over, discuss her, and speak up. Today, we bear witness to the many stories told and the stories that have yet to be told. Will we allow these stories to change us? The author of Judges hopes so, alongside with us. Ending with words from survivor and author Crawford, quote, "In bearing witness, we're trying to correct a theft of power via a story. But power and stories, while deeply interconnected, are not the same things. One is a rock, the other is water. Over time, long periods of time, water always wins. What I want to know even now is how." Thank you.
Thank you, Alexiana. That was wonderful. Very illuminating thoughts. And thank you for bringing a much needed focus on the other woman in Judges 19. I think most papers on Judges 19 go on and on about the text, but I think you've added something very valuable here. If you have a question for Alexiana, please put it in the chat, or you can be like Helen and just raise your hand. No, we'll give her. Helen, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you so much, Alexiana. That was really, really interesting. Appreciated that. I've been thinking a little bit about fungibility, about bodies that are interchangeable for one another. And I think I see quite a lot of that in the Hebrew narratives, whether it's wives swapping with each other. There's a whole lot of stuff going on there. And I was wondering if you see any of that in this narrative and whether that plays in. I appreciate this wasn't quite the focus of your paper, so I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just wondering, and just kind of having a wonder out loud, really.
Oh, good wonder out loud. I have not given much thought to that until you have just now asked that question. And that's really intriguing to consider in light of this. Oh,
sorry.
Yeah.
No, I think I've thrown in a red herring. Please ignore.
No, please send me that via email. I would love to chat further about that, because that is incredibly intriguing to me.
Helen's just trying to deep the question.
No comment.
Helen's just trying to get back at you for the sass.
I don't I do not blame her.
No. Johanna asks, can the virgin daughter be brought into dialogue with Lot's daughters too?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I originally cut a bunch of stuff involving the parallelism as Lot's daughters are sort of offered up, and then actually in turn you could sort of, while it's also this act of, in some case, weirdness after the fact where Lot's daughters sleep with him, it could also in some cases be a weird revenge fantasy, but that's
what I was getting at. I just wondered, because there's clearly so much of an echo between the two stories.
Yep. Like you just offered us up.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just wondered whether there is a kind of fantasy dimension there, where in terms of how the story then plays out in the Genesis version. And it's interesting. I've never really thought about it. So thank you for your presentation. But how she's just completely elided, and it's odd that she's there at all, isn't it? So thank you for drawing attention to her.
Thanks.
Jennifer has a question, and interesting enough, she gave a paper yesterday on Genesis 19.
She did. Sorry, I missed it.
Is the concubine then a parallel for Lot? So the concubine being a parallel for Lot, and the substitute for the virgin daughters?
I feel like the concubine would be a parallel for one of Lot's daughters, more so than it would have been for Lot. Lot's parallel would probably more likely either be the Levite, but most likely in this case, the old man host. So while they are extremely similar, they are also extremely dissimilar in certain aspects. So I view, and I'm not sure who's retelling who, but I think one of them is the original folk story, and then it's being retold, I think due to different circumstances that are occurring in historical context. Because in one story, God shows up. The messengers of Yahweh show up. Actually, they are the guests themselves, and they fix it. But where's God in this one is a fun thing. So making the parallels, I think, is a little difficult, but also, the concubine would be more of a parallel for one of Lot's daughters, or Lot's daughters in general, just unfairly, barely there and thrown out. And the substitute for the virgin daughters.
What question for you would be, do you see the treatment of the bad dad, the guy in later in the chapter who offered his daughter? Do you see his actions in distinction to the Levite's wife, the woman's own father? Do you see them as trying to be contrasted, or are they one and the same? Are they both?
I kind of read them as one and the same, to be honest. I think that's some of the blurriness of all of that, in that there's not really an easy answer here. People contrast the hospitality narratives, right? Because this one's so lavish, it's so amazing, but maybe it also could be him trying to keep him there and control the Levite, and but in essence, he still objectifies his own daughter. She's still just an object. And in the same light, that's sort of how the old man is, even though he's a little less willing to take them in, but don't stay in the square. So it sort of muddies the waters a bit, but I see them as very similar.
Maybe the point is to critique the nice forms of patriarchy and showing it the darker.
He's okay.
Yeah. He's
still, it still did the same thing as hashtag not all men. I'm sure that's what the one dad is saying. But
that's great. Now we're going to move to this time. Thank you so much, Alexiana. But we're going to move to a time of open Q&A. So if you had a question for one of our other presenters, or you want to kind of bring them all into conversation, please do so. Either put your question in the chat, or if it's one of those questions that you're just dying to ask and you're like, I need to ask this, just raise your hand either on the screen or put up your little hand icon, and then I'll ask you to unmute and you can ask. Oh, Johanna has a question. Go for it.
I'm just curious, how did you all come up with your ideas? I mean, I never, Hannah, would have thought of, you know, the Me Too, and it worked so beautifully. What kind of sparked it? With all of you, I wondered that. With the Watching Women and with the daughter, you know, what sparked it?
So for me, I was reading a book by Ruth Everett, who's a priest in America.
Me Too Reckoning.
Yeah. And she just mentioned, it was just a throwaway line where she went, you know, mentioning about David and Bathsheba being mentioned right there alongside, you know, the birth of Jesus and this kind of inaugurated God's justice. And it just made me think immediately of, all the other women in that genealogy. And there are quite a few articles out there trying to make that suggestion. And there's a really recent one by Marika Rose from 2019, reflecting on how this might, you know, sexual violation being something which unites them. Scholars aren't united on why the women would be in the genealogy. But yeah, it went from that throwaway line, really.
Thank you. What about you, Siobhán? This trauma theology is something I'm finding really popular with my students, and it's interesting that two of the papers really alluded to it directly. Where did your spark come from?
Yeah, so it's born out of a section of my thesis. So I'm working on the reception of Mary Magdalene, and when looking at El Greco's Ferrara crucifixion, and considering the role of the Magdalene and then the women more broadly in that, using that painting first of all in the actual project as a lens back onto the text, kind of provoked this further consideration about what that distance means and what else is going on in it. And I think I just find that trauma-informed reading is really helpful to frame that and really get into the text.
Basically, I'm just being nosy and seeing where your ideas come from, but thank you so much. What about you, Alexiana? And then I'll mute myself.
My dissertation work is on Judges 19, and I am also a survivor myself, and so it was my therapist who pointed it out, that part of even me working through some of Judges 19, it feels like it is a reworking of my own trauma through my research and my studying. But I just kept noticing that nobody was talking about the other daughter and how terrifying it would be to be her in that position. So yeah, between that and reading tons of memoirs that are coming out lately, which is both encouraging and horrible. Ironically, a lot of them reference not only the Me Too movement, but I wore her shirt yesterday. She testified against Brett Kavanaugh. And a lot of these memoirs are pointing to her, even as we saw you testify when against all odds. So yeah, just thinking about the people who have been victimized but haven't said anything and are silenced, and what does it mean to see them when we can't? Yeah.
I think Kristen has a question. Kristen, if you would like, you could unmute yourself and ask it yourself.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my question is for Siobhán. First of all, thank you for such an interesting paper. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on why it is that the women chose to remain with Jesus beyond just the fact that maybe they were perceived as less of a threat and therefore it was less dangerous for them to stay with Jesus versus the men who went into hiding. I'm just wondering if there could be something about being victims of patriarchal oppression that allows them to remain with Jesus all the way till the end.
Yeah, thanks. I kind of, certainly I think in terms of the accounts of the burial, I think that's a really sort of convincing reading. So in Luke and in John, it's not just women, but the women are flagged in particular. And as I say, I think what I found helpful about this type of trauma reading is that it does help us to think about why that is the case. And so obviously on a purely literary level, you know, we can talk about that's a recognized tradition and that's something that's known and that's why it has to be woven into the text. But thinking about it from within the story, I think there's definitely some resonance of people who experience difficult things can empathize and can relate in a particular way. So yeah, I definitely think there's kind of something fruitful in that. Yeah.
I know Erica, I can't pronounce your last name. Erica had a question earlier. I wondered if you wanted to ask that.
Sure. It was in response to Professor Stiebert's paper, and also in light of the fact that I have a teenage daughter, and a lot of my friends have daughters between the ages of 12 and 20. But I've just been thinking a lot about the whole Adam and Eve eating from the tree of good and knowledge of good and evil, as it has been read through. Like, I just keep getting this response from people that the primary problem with the eating of the tree was that they became aware of their sexuality. And it's just really interesting to me, in light of purity culture, and the problems that you brought up of virginity and losing your virginity, and the fact that we basically discernment of knowledge of good and evil, of course, is like seen as a great thing throughout the rest of the Bible, and also being being fruitful and multiplying and being sexual beings as a part of like blessing and progeny and good things in the Bible. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that interpretation, if you think that is a significant part of the.
I do think it is. It's very fraught, isn't it? And I have a daughter. She's about to turn 13 next month. So it's these conversations. They touch you in a very personal way. There's been, between the Guardian newspaper about the minuscule number of rape cases that reach any kind of charge, and yesterday's Radio 4 documentary about abuse in schools. It's a really difficult environment, isn't it? It's so ambiguous. I think that whole thing about knowledge and its relationship with sexuality, I think you're right. On the one hand, certainly in Jewish interpretations, it's very often seen as a blessing, knowledge and scholarship and learning, and yet it is in one thrust of the tradition something that's kind of kept away from women. And I think there was another question in the thread that said that there was some kind of anxiety in men about women knowing too much. And I think there's something in that. The man who knows lots of women seems to be one who is, in some interpretations, celebrated. I mean, look at Solomon. He was so wise and he had so many women. Whereas for the woman, it seems to be the opposite. There seems to be an anxiety about her having this knowledge, her having carnal knowledge. And I try to allude to that in a bit about how the loss of virginity, as it's called, comes with the knowledge, the carnal knowledge that is gained. Yeah, but for the woman, that's much more ambivalent than for the man, is what I'm getting as we branch out on that and look at that topic more widely. So I think you're right, there's an ambiguity there, but I think there is more of a negative slant put on that. And that's certainly true of the early Christian interpreters. Elaine Pagels has written a great book about early Christian interpretation of the Adam and Eve story, where the kind of carnal knowledge for the woman is definitely seen as something really problematic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perhaps a final question to kind of wrap up this session, unfortunately. Maybe, each of these papers spoke very personally, very deeply, very disturbing and yet important topics. And I wondered if, part of the CSBV's mission is to bridge that kind of gap between the academy and various faith communities. And I wondered if you might wish to say or speak of how your research, how your paper can affect various faith communities, and whether, what should the church, the synagogue, or any type of faith, what can they learn from you? How can we learn from your work and apply that in our various communities?
Is that to all of us? Because I think, somebody like Hannah is much more in touch with church communities than I am. I see myself I work with people a lot, and some of them are part of faith communities. But I suspect our other speakers can probably tackle that one better.
It was an open question.
I can try and answer it. Yeah, next month I'm being ordained into a church which has not only perpetrated absolutely horrendous things, but has covered up horrendous things. There is a diocese in the Church of England which has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on non-disclosure agreements. And it's horrifying, it's really sickening. I'm an evangelical. If you are at all up to date with what's happening in Anglican evangelical circles, we've currently got 2 sexual abuse scandals going on at the moment. This sounds far more noble than it actually is in practice. Obviously, I research sexual consent. Nobody ever wants to talk to me about my research because it's really uncomfortable. And I very much am feeling that tension of, I'm going to swear a load of oaths to the church and to the bishop, but my primary calling is from God, and that always has to come first. So I always hope that I never feel at home in the Church of England fully. I always hope I never feel fully comfortable in all the robes and the collar and whatever. And I hope my research never stops making me feel a little bit ill and really quite drained. Like, I will take this work being really exhausting and really hard if it means trying not to be part of perpetuating darkness in an institution which, for all the good it does, don't get me wrong, does some really amazing things. But I don't want to be, I would rather be an outsider in the institution than be complicit in darkness. And yes, so do feel free over the next 50, 60 years of ministry just to keep prodding me and making sure that I'm really uncomfortable, because that's the biggest gift. So on behalf of the Church of England, I'm really sorry. We've done horrendous things, and I'm really, really sorry. And I wish I could say it's going to change. I'm a Christian ethicist. I know that sin never goes away, so I can't promise anything, but I can say that there are people who do care. Yes, sorry, that was all a bit word vomity, but yeah, sorry.
That was beautiful. Alexiana, Siobhán, would you like to add anything to that?
I don't think I can add much to that, but I'll say what I've said to you separately. Thinking about this from my own faith background, I'm a Catholic, so thinking about this in terms of the sacrament of the Eucharist, I think what I hope to gain from it, because I'm doing work that I hope can inform my faith life. I can't speak to hope that it can inform the wider church necessarily. Is that, you know, in engaging sacramentally, that we engage with both the real presence in the sacrament, but also the real presence in the church around us, and looking again at those stories, I hope reminds us to look again in our communities as well.
That's awesome. Alexiana, final words?
I born and raised in the church, evangelical white church here in the United States. And so obviously there's a reckoning happening over here, and it needs to be happening. And I'm just grateful to be a part of it within myself, as I dig up some of this in my own self, but also with those around me who want to be following the Spirit of the Lord. And yeah. Nothing more to say there. Hannah really covered it. So,
well, thank you so much to each and every one of you for being here, but thank you especially for our presenters. Would you guys give them a round of applause? That wraps up this session. Our next session is tomorrow at the same time, 7 p.m. BST, London time. It is the Emerging Scholars session. You really don't want to miss it. It's going to be super awesome. Our keynote speaker, probably why it's going to be so awesome, is our center's very own Helen Paynter. There will also be a prize award for the best paper, so you're going to want to come along to that. I also wanted to bring to your attention all the things that CSBV is up to. In addition to our normal blog on our website, we've just started a new blog called Sunday Sermon, Monday Morning. We might have been a bit too clever there. Monday Morning, you know, MOURNING, which attempts to help pastors and preachers tackle some of these tricky passages that they might encounter in their ministry. We also have a podcast called Guns and God, which is with a title like that, need I say more? But it is hosted by Drs. Maria Power and Michael Spaglione. We have also just launched a journal for the study of Bible and violence, and the first issue will be out very soon. So perhaps this conference has sparked an idea for an article or something. You know, get in touch with the center or with Dr. Ashley Hibbard, who's the editor. The edited book from our first conference, Bible on Violence, A Thick Description, which I think Helen is waving around there, is already out, so you can get that. And the one from last year, In the Crosshairs, Bible and Violence in Focus, will be out soon, as well as the papers from this conference will be published in due time. Finally, if you would like to financially support the work of the center with a one-off or recurring donation, you can do so on our website, and all of this and more can be found at our website, which I'm putting in the chat just in case you didn't know where it was. Yeah, that's all we have today. Thank you so much for coming. We will be keeping this Zoom room open if you wanted to hang out, mingle, you know, in a global pandemic. We can do so safely on Zoom, vaccinated or not, you know, you can hang out, but no obligation to stay. And that goes for our conference presenters. If it's late, go to bed. If you want to eat food, I don't know, do what you want. I'm going to hang out. You can hang out. We can all hang out. But thank you so much for coming. This formally marks the end